The title of my presentation today is pretty much about carbon accountability. So the term carbon accountability, what I meant by carbon is about environmental problem, climate change, and global warming. Climate scientists has pretty much established that we live in the world of Anthropocene, which means that it is very, very likely that human activities contributes to the unprecedented level of greenhouse gas emissions, which might be dangerous to human life. And by accountability, of course, I mean a form of calculation and reporting, accounting. So by combining these two terms together, carbon accountability, I want to explore the kind of calculation and reporting for greenhouse gas emission in such a way to mitigate environmental problems. So the outline of my presentation today would be, I would give a little bit on background on greenhouse gas accounting, and then literature review, for research question, research design, challenges, and then Q&A, of course. So to give you a little bit of background on greenhouse gas accounting, so to account for GHG emission, obviously this is like a very illustrative, very simple graph. So firstly, obviously, you have the actual emission, number one. And from actual emission, you can actually like track the carbon, the molecules itself, and then you can calculate the amount of emission. But obviously, that kind of process is not very convenient. A more feasible way would be to estimate the amount of greenhouse gas emission that your organizations are emitting. So in order to estimate that kind of data, you can collect an indirect source of information, such as kilograms of coal consumed, or the amount of liters of oil used, your electricity, or miles traveled. And from there on, you gather the whole data on your companies, your organizations, whatever, which can be gathered, like centralized, can allocate this responsibility to the centralized function or to decentralized function, which means that you allocate the responsibility to each individual division. And after collecting the data, the third step, you plug in the numbers into a greenhouse gas calculator, which will estimate the amount of greenhouse gas emission that your organizations are producing every year. And obviously, the fourth step comes the accounting and reporting part. So ideally, you would want to report your greenhouse gas emissions to your stakeholders. And then normally, at this level, you categorize the different kind of emissions into scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1 is defined as the direct energy use. There's energy which comes from your power plant, from your factory, from your manufacturing process, etc. And scope 2 consists of purchased energy, such as electricity. So with electricity, you don't use you don't emit the carbon directly, but it is being indirectly emitted by another organization, that is your power provider. And scope 3 is the emission which comes from your value chain, that is your customer and then your supplier as well. So scope 1, scope 2 is quite an established practice because it can be reliably measured, but scope 3 is still quite feeble. And then ideally, the purpose of accounting for greenhouse gas emission is that you want to have this virtuous circle of accounting and then improvement. So the idea is that by accounting for something, for knowing something, you can make improvement to the perceived deficiency in your activity. But it is not quite evident how it works, this circle of accounting and improvement. So I turned to the accounting and literature review, accounting and literature to understand really how does these numbers work, how does the numbers influence our behaviors. So in the literature, accounting is rather being described quite broadly. So in the literature, accounting is described as a calculative practice. So calculative practice can be anything really. It doesn't have to be financial accounting as we commonly know it. It doesn't have to be balance sheet or profit and loss statement. Accounting, so for example, take an example of managerial accounting. Although it resembles the form of financial accounting, but the purpose is quite different, really. Managerial accounting is not being published to your shareholders for the reason that it's primarily used is for managerial decision making. Coming to the point of purpose, what is the purpose of accounting? So accounting is a calculative practice, so, but what is the reason for producing this calculation, right? What is the purpose of producing these numbers? So we can try to understand this purpose for creating these numbers by looking at the system. So Roberts and Scapens shifts the discussion into the system of accountability. So rather than asking about the accounting process itself, they look into the system in general. So according to Roberts and Scapens, they define accountability as a moral order almost. So a moral order, which is like very, very value-laden. Consider the notions of holding others into account. So when you hold others into account, there is this external element, obviously, where there is this legal contracting sense where you can bring others into account by claiming your rights. What is your rights in that kind of system? But also there's like this more subtle element to it as well, like the subjectification of a person to certain value. So the person who you bring into accounts, they will, to some extent, be influenced by that fact as well, right? And then they're going to model their behavior into that certain value. So coming from that perspective, we can almost consider environmental accounting as an attempt to infuse environmentalism value into organizations. The use of accounting calculation in this sense is non-neutral, is always implicated in the construction of ideological discourse. So Michaela suggests to study ideology in practice, essentially to study the use of accounting as a language. So looking at accounting as language, then the discussion becomes the construction of an accountable field. So the calculative accounts, the numbers itself, becomes like the basis for the construction of an accountable field. But what I mean by an accountable field is that issues becomes calculable. Issues become calculable, and calculable issues is easier to be negotiated. Therefore, issues become calculable, and then becomes negotiable, and then ultimately becomes actionable. So I turn into a field of linguistic studies to understand the role of accounting as a language, and adapting from Fairclough 1992. This makes a very good model to explain how the numbers works. So at first level, you have the calculative practice, the center of it, and then these numbers almost constructs this field, this force field, which creates a political arena where issues can be negotiated. And then from there on, obviously, there's the third level, the social practice level, where ideology comes into play as well. How the social discourse is being reflected into organizations, and retrospectively is being influenced by what is manifest actions. So from there on, I wrap up my research question into so does mandatory reporting increase carbon accountability? Coming back to the beginning, the problem of environmental change, of unprecedented level of greenhouse gas emission, then the question that I want to ask is whether mandatory reporting increases carbon accountability. So externally, whether there is changes in the level of disclosures of greenhouse gas related data, that is both calculative and narrative data. And then internally, how does this mandatory reporting regime influences environmental governance process? Then I want to penetrate into the internal mechanism. I want to understand the interplay between energy policy and accounting. So in order to understand the internal mechanism of accountability, I asked whether carbon accountability can change organizations' energy policy. That is, their ability to track environmental data, ability to legitimize environmental project, and an ability to engage in environmental pressure, and sometimes also to shape the environmental pressure, perhaps. So in terms of the research design, in order to answer the first question, I limit my scope to examine the mandatory reporting regime, which is the effect of the strategic report and Directors Report Regulations 2013, amendment to Companies Act 2006, which requires listed companies to disclose GHG-related data. And then secondly, in order to answer the second research question, I want to, the organizational process which I examine is the changes in energy policy. So the reason being for choosing energy policy is because I think, I would argue that GHG accounting is inherently a tool for energy governance. Because if you look at the scope of GHG accounting, one, you look at the, you analyze direct energy. And scope 2 and scope 3, you analyze indirect energy. So there might be lots of environmental problems within organizations, but GHG accounting is inherently a tool for energy governance, I would argue. Because like, they look at energy, so I would think that it would make sense to look at energy policy. And by energy policy, I meant the policy to reduce the level of energy consumption, or the decision to switch to cleaner source, or others. For example, purchase of renewable energy certificate. And in terms of methodology, I propose to conduct a content analysis of FTSE 350 companies. So these regulations just came into force the latter part of last year, I believe. So I want to look at this, this report and analyze how disclosures changes. And then I want to compare it as well to the previous reporting year and then subsequent reporting year. And a second phase of my study would be to conduct like a case study with a smaller sample size, maybe like 3 organizations, let's say. And the purpose of doing this case study is to really get into this qualitative kind of data, to collect this qualitative data to understand how the numbers changes the organizational process and perhaps decision making as well. So in a case study, ideally, I would like to get like around 10 or 15 participants. I would think, and then the candidate would be perhaps like a sustainable team, reporting team, research team, or perhaps like some number of CISOs executives as well, like probably like chief sustainability officer, chief operating officer, or perhaps like chief executive officer, depending on the organizations. Right. Finally. So obviously there are lots of methodological issues as well. The data interpretation, access would be vital, and then interviewings can be sensitive as well. But I believe with the sufficient level of mitigation, it shouldn't be a problem. So there is this anecdotal saying which says that what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So the purpose of my research really is to almost to flip this around and ask, so does that mean that what does get measured gets done? Is it always the case, and how? So since I haven't finished my data collection yet, I haven't finished my data analysis yet, I don't think it would be quite fair to conclude my presentation. So, but I just want to share my thesis. And so there's this thing in hashtag in Twitter, hashtag share my thesis, which encourages DPhil students to share their thesis, the purpose of doing the research in a very succinct way, so you have to be like very brief. If I were to share my thesis, it would be something around constructing carbon accountability in organizations. It's crucial because it empowers energy policy reform from within. With that, I would like to bring my presentation to the close, and comments would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just, it sounds like a noble project trying to find out the effect of carbon accounting on the behavior of these firms, and but how in the world would you actually do it? I mean, how can you tell whether a firm changed their policy because of their carbon accounting, or because maybe there were lots of demonstrators out in front of the CDO's house complaining about their carbon policy? I mean, how do you identify a causal effect?
Well, I mean, like, the causal relationship between greenhouse gas accounting and then energy policies is something that I don't want to claim. So perhaps what I'm trying to say is that there is like more of a perhaps like proximate relationship. So like obviously there are lots of factors which might lead to the changes in energy policy, and I take that. But I think one of the factors would be the ability to track the environmental data in itself. So greenhouse gas accounting might lead to the changes in energy policy, but it is not always the case. So it can becomes like the basis, but yeah.
Well, it's certainly very possible, but I mean, when you go to look at this firm, how will you try to identify whether the accounting made a difference?
So in sorry. So in the case study phase, I would be doing like interviews, like qualitative interviews. So we'll be asking like, how does your reporting policy changes, and then how does your like energy policy changes in relation to that as well.
To ask them sort of how did this new reporting policy affect your energy usage policy?
Well, yeah, to your process and hence your policy to some extent as well.
Because my concern was kind of pretty much the same as Tom's, and thinking about the case study. So you go in, and the generic idea is you're looking at how changes or the introduction of new ways of accounting lead to changes in organizational practices, rules, etc. And there's this question then of how to relate the one. So you introduce a new way of accounting for energy consumption, for carbon footprint, and so on, and then you see some organizational change. And your answer still leaves me a bit worried, because so then you go to the actors involved, and you ask them, how do you think that this new accounting rule has changed policies or changed the ways you do things? And I'm just worried that there's obviously a lot of kind of inherent biases which might want people to claim changes that happen, or might in some sense encourage people to attribute changes, maybe because they were involved in the introduction of these practices. So in some sense, how do you disentangle that? So the accounts that people, so since in some sense you can't look at the counterfactual, and you're not looking historically at how things change, and even if you did, then you'd have to control for all sorts of things. Then you get these accounts of people's claims about how they believe their internal organizational practices and so on have changed as a consequence of, but these are not disinterested accounts. And so how do you deal with that?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, like there's this inherent issue of bias as well, right? Especially when you're talking about like almost like moral issues, which is like becoming like hotter and hotter every minute now. But yeah, I think like one of the methodological issues that I highlighted is the data analysis itself can be quite tricky. So one way to do it obviously would be to modify to
But I mean, the data analysis is going to give you correlations. It's going to show that here's how certain ways of accounting changed, and here's how certain accounting results were produced, certain things were calculated, and here's a time sequence of changes in organizational practices. But that doesn't give you a causal mechanism. Now, your shortcut through that is to say, I will ask people if A caused B. But my concern is that there might be a strong incentive for A to claim that this caused us to do that. So how do you guard against that?
Sorry. So like the objectives of my research is not precisely to gauge like causal relationship. So it's more like a processual kind of research. So how does it like changes organizational process, which might lead to like changes in actions as well. So I'm not like claiming causal relationship here. So
what
I'm not quite sure
what would be the nature of the sort of claim? So if you could, a potential claim, in say 1 or 2 sentences, a potential claim you would be able to hope to pull out of a case study like that. What would that look like?
Well, for once, if when they were like discussing energy policy, for example, I'm not quite sure, but if they're starting to refer to the numbers as a claim to legitimize like certain project, then you can say
so do the numbers enter their narratives in some sense?
Yes, yes. So it's not necessarily like causal. So that's not like much fine.
Hi. I had a quick question because in some areas, like Washington State, at least in the U.S., there's some of the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act, which a number of corporations have agreed to report on an annual basis their carbon emissions. And would that be a vehicle that you could use, this legislation that now the corporations are agreeing that they will do this reporting, and then because of this, I think that they enacted it in like 2012, but the idea would be that you could look at those organizations that have agreed to follow that accounting reporting practice on an annual basis, and you could see how, as it related to the regulation, or their agreement to follow the act as part of their accountancy, that they agreed to the Carbon Accountability Act, for example, in Washington State, how that changed from perhaps when they started in 2012 to how it changed to 2015, for example. Would that be something to see the impact in the organization, because you could actually see how much they reported on an annual basis?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm not quite familiar with the case that you're referring to. So there are lots of different ways to account for like environmental impacts, and one of them is greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm not quite sure whether it's similar to what I'm alluding to, but yeah, I think that's the kind of things that I want to try to do, like longitudinal data to some extent as well, to see like how process changes over time as a result of regulations.
I have one curiosity-based question, which is kind of about scope 2, I guess. Which is when these days when companies are buying in energy for a provider, which is typically going to be a mix of different power generation sources, to what extent do they actually really know what the mix of power they're buying is and what the impact is? So because we kind of said scope 1, scope 2, unproblematic, let's focus on scope 3, that's hard. But you know, can we actually tick the box on scope 2? Do most organizations really know that?
No, that's a very good question, because like scope 2 is quite controversial as well, because like people are saying that some of energy is being generated with renewable sources, so they shouldn't be counted as carbon emitting if they come from renewable sources. So there's a big debate as well. So one of the standard setters in this area is called a greenhouse gas protocol, and then they've been debating this scope 2 as well, and they just came into conclusion. I think it was like perhaps like last month, and then they just like produced a new standard. So they revised their standard from saying that. So there's actually like, according to the standards, they categorize the different kind of measurement of electricity into 2 things. So one would be like plant-based, so your plant manufacturing, where the electricity comes from, and then but the second part would be to actually analyze the contract. So the contract which comes between you and then your power providers, and then so this becomes like a problem of the power providers being able to show that they generate their electricity from renewable resources. So if you look at the contract level, then you can pretty much.
But this is not routinely being done now, because
no,
this is not current practice for most organizations.
It's very new. It was just released last month.
Yeah.
I
think in that case, let's close down, and thank you, Timotius, once again.
Thank you.